The army that formed up on a Louisiana plain on the morning of January 8, 1815, was the finest infantry force on earth, and every man in it knew it. These soldiers had spent a decade dismantling Napoleon's empire across the length of Spain and France. Their boots had worn grooves into roads from Lisbon to Toulouse. Their bayonets had gone over fortress walls at Badajoz, in darkness so total they navigated by the screams of the men ahead of them. 4 months earlier, they had sailed up the Chesapeake and burned the American capital to the ground and walked away without a scratch. Defeating them was not just unlikely, it was, by the military standards of the age, impossible. And on this January morning, standing in formation on flat ground, staring across 1,500 yards of open plain at a crude wall of mud and timber, they were terrified, not cautious, not nervous, terrified, because they had already tested that wall, twice, and twice it had torn them apart. They knew what was behind it. 20 naval guns positioned to hit them from 2 directions at once, across ground that offered no cover, no ditch, no fold in the earth, nothing between them and the muzzles except 1,500 yards of soft mud and the knowledge that every step forward brought them closer to a ditch full of sharpened stakes and thorn bush that would hold them in place while the canister finished them. In 30 minutes, 2,037 British soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties, 71. That is not a battle. That is an execution. And the most extraordinary part is that the war was already over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed 2 weeks earlier. Nobody on this field knew it. 2,037 men paid for a victory that did not need to happen in a war that had already ended. But treaties travel by ship. Canister travels at 1,000 feet per second. And on the morning of January 8, 1815, canister arrived first. The War of 1812 had been a bruising, inconclusive mess. The Americans had failed to conquer Canada. The British had sailed up the Chesapeake and burned Washington in August 1814, torching the Capitol and the President's house, while Dolly Madison carried a portrait of George Washington out a back door. Peace negotiations ground forward at Ghent in Belgium, but neither side trusted the other to stop fighting until signatures dried. And possession on the ground would matter more than words on paper regardless. Britain saw its chance. Napoleon was exiled to Elba. Thousands of Peninsular War veterans were suddenly available. The plan was clean. Seize New Orleans. Control the Mississippi. The river was the economic spine of every American state west of the Appalachians. Furs, grain, timber, the entire commerce of the interior flowed through that port. Lose New Orleans and the young republic becomes a coastal nation with a British lock on its heartland. The Treaty of Ghent was signed December 24, 1814. It would not be ratified until February 1815. The bloodiest American victory of the entire war would be fought in the gap between diplomacy and the speed of a sailing ship. Into this crisis walked a man who should not have been standing. Andrew Jackson was gaunt, sharp-featured, and operating on willpower that had outlasted his body by several years. He carried a bullet lodged near his heart from a duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806. Dickinson had shot first and hit him in the chest. Jackson, bleeding through his coat, had steadied his pistol and killed the man. The bullet was never removed. It sat against his ribs for the rest of his life, a piece of lead that reminded him with every deep breath that he had survived something that should have killed him, and that surviving had cost the other man everything. He arrived in New Orleans on December 1st and found a city divided by language, loyalty, and fear. French Creoles distrusted Americans. Americans distrusted everyone else. The governor was skeptical. The legislature was discussing surrender. Jackson ended that conversation with a declaration of martial law that terrified the city's comfortable classes almost as much as the approaching British. Then he looked at the terrain south of the city and chose his ground. The Rodriguez Canal was a dry mill race running perpendicular to the Mississippi River, roughly 4 miles south of the city. It stretched from the riverbank on the west to impassable cypress swamp on the east. Between the swamp and the river lay approximately 1,500 yards of flat, open plain. No trees, no fences, no features of any kind except soft Louisiana mud that grabbed at boots and slowed every step. Jackson recognized what he was looking at with the eye of a man who had been fighting since he was 13 years old, and who had a scar on his skull from a British officer's saber received during the Revolutionary War when he was a prisoner of war. A boy prisoner, scarred for refusing to shine an officer's boots. That scar had taught him something about the British that no West Point education could provide. They relied on discipline and formation, and the assumption that their enemy would break before contact. A natural choke point where geography did the work that soldiers usually have to do themselves. Any army advancing from the south would be funneled into this corridor with no room to maneuver around the flanks. The swamp was impassable. The river was uncrossable under fire. The only way through was straight ahead across 1,500 yards of open killing ground. Jackson turned this canal into the most lethal defensive position in the Western Hemisphere. His engineers and soldiers built breastworks from packed earth and heavy timber, loopholes cut at regular intervals for musket fire, raised platforms behind the wall for artillery crews, earthen embankments thick enough to absorb cannonballs without collapsing. The canal itself was widened to 10 feet and filled with 1 to 2 feet of standing water. Into this ditch, Jackson's men drove sharpened stakes pointing outward and tangled masses of thorn bush so thick that a man trying to wade through would be caught like a fish in a net, his uniform snagged, his equipment tangled. His body held in place while the men above him fired down through loopholes at a range where missing was physically impossible. On the right bank of the Mississippi, Commodore Daniel Patterson positioned 20 guns in a Marine battery. Naval-grade cannon aimed to deliver enfilading fire across the entire front of Jackson's line. Any British column advancing toward the breastworks would be hit from the front by Jackson's guns and raked from the right side by Patterson's. Crossfire, the geometry that turns a difficult position into a death trap. The defenders could hit the attackers from 2 directions simultaneously. The attackers could only shoot in one direction at a time. Redoubts along the main line held 24-pounders and 12-pounders stripped from the USS Louisiana, ship-killing weapons now aimed at men walking across an open field. The math was simple. A 24-pound cannonball, fired into a column of men standing shoulder to shoulder, does not stop at the first body. It goes through the first and the second and the third, and does not stop until physics says it stops. And canister, tin cans packed with musket balls, sprayed across a formation at waist height like a giant shotgun blast that could clear a lane 20 yards wide in a single discharge. Jackson had built a corridor of death. 1,500 yards long, with no cover, bordered by impassable terrain, defended by naval guns firing from 2 directions, and sealed at the end by a ditch full of thorns that would hold any survivor in place for the killing shot. The only thing missing was someone reckless enough to walk into it. Jackson's defending force was the most improbable army ever assembled on American soil. U.S. Army regulars stood alongside Tennessee and Kentucky militia, frontiersmen who had grown up with rifles and who could hit a target at distances that European muskets could not reach. Louisiana militia filled the gaps. 2 battalions of free black soldiers from New Orleans held their own section of the main line. Men whose valor on this field would stand as proof of something the nation would spend another 50 years refusing to acknowledge. Choctaw warriors scouted the swamps. And then there were the pirates. Jean Lafitte was a smuggler, a privateer, and a man the United States government had tried to arrest months earlier. He operated out of Barataria Bay, south of the city, with a fleet of armed vessels and a network of contacts, channels, and hiding places that no outsider could navigate. The British had approached him first, offering money and a Royal Navy commission if he would help them take New Orleans. Lafitte played both sides. He warned the Americans about the British approach and offered his own services instead. Jackson was suspicious. He called Lafitte's men hellish banditti. But Jackson needed what Lafitte had. Not primarily his fighting men, though they were experienced in boarding actions and close combat. He needed flints. He needed powder. The American supply chain, stretched across hundreds of miles of frontier, had failed to deliver sufficient quantities of either. Without gun flints, the muskets along Jackson's line were clubs. Without powder, the cannons were furniture. Lafitte provided 7,500 flints and enough powder to keep every gun on the line firing for hours. The pirates of Barrataria Bay, the men the U.S. Navy had been hunting for years, supplied the ammunition that made the victory possible. Among Jackson's gunners were men who had served in the French artillery, professionals who could load and fire a cannon with the speed and precision of a naval gun crew. They would need every second of that training on the morning of January 8th. Before the main assault, 3 violent encounters taught the British exactly what they were walking into. Each one stripped away another layer of confidence. By January 8, the veterans who had conquered Spain were no longer certain they could conquer a ditch. On the evening of December 23rd, Jackson did something that defied all military logic and defined his character in a single night. He attacked. The British had just arrived. 1,800 men under Colonel William Thornton had landed near the Villeray plantation, 9 miles south of the city. They were making tea, literally. British soldiers setting up camp, building cooking fires, congratulating themselves on an unopposed landing. They expected the Americans to be behind walls waiting. Instead, the schooner USS Carolina opened fire from the river at 7:30 in the evening, lobbing shells into the British bivouac while the men were still eating. 30 minutes later, Jackson's infantry hit the camp from multiple directions in total darkness. The chaos was absolute. Men fought hand to hand among sugarcane stubble that had been cut to ankle height, sharp enough to slice through boot leather, slippery with evening dew that turned the plantation floor into an ice rink of mud and cane stalks. Soldiers grappled in the dark with enemies they identified by the texture of their uniforms. A rough, homespun American jacket felt different from a British wool coat. That difference, felt in the dark by a hand that could not see, was sometimes the only thing separating a knife thrust from a handshake. The raid was not a decisive victory. Both sides took roughly 200 casualties. But the psychological effect was devastating beyond anything the casualty numbers suggested. These soldiers had expected a walkover. Their intelligence described a panicking city defended by amateur militia. Instead, they had been attacked on their first night in Louisiana by an enemy who was supposed to be running. Men who had slept through bivouacs in Spain without concern found themselves lying awake in Louisiana sugarcane fields, listening for sounds that might be another assault coming through the dark. The seed of doubt was planted in soil that would only grow worse. On December 28th, Pakenham ordered a reconnaissance in force. 2 columns advanced toward the American line. The Riverside column was savaged by the crossfire that would define January 8. The probe failed. Casualties Pakenham could not afford. The seed of doubt grew roots. On January 1, the British tried the textbook European solution: artillery bombardment. Silence the American guns before sending infantry. They brought forward their own cannon and opened fire. American counter-battery fire dismounted several British pieces. The British gunners expended most of their heavy ammunition without putting a single breach in Jackson's line. The guns that were supposed to save the infantry from the ditch were now empty. The seed of doubt bloomed into fear. By January 8, every British soldier who had survived these 3 encounters knew exactly what waited across that 1,500 yards of open ground. A fortified line their artillery could not suppress. Gunners who could hit them from 2 directions, and a ditch full of thorns at the end that would hold them in place while the canister finished the job. They lined up anyway, because they were British infantry, and British infantry does what it is told. January 8, 1815. Still dark, a heavy fog clings to the Mississippi plain. 7,000 men form up in assault columns, shoulder to shoulder, rank upon rank. The lead companies carry fascines and ladders. Without them, the ditch cannot be crossed and the wall cannot be climbed. The men carrying them understand with cold clarity that they will be the first into the kill zone with their hands full and no ability to fire back. The columns step off. The fog muffles everything. For the first few hundred yards there is nothing but the squelch of boots in wet ground and the clink of equipment and the smell of the Mississippi, brackish and heavy with silt, mixing with the wool and sweat of thousands of men packed into formations designed for a different century. The American line is invisible. Then the fog begins to lift. The weak January sun burns through, and the gray curtain peels back yard by yard. What the British saw when the mist cleared would haunt every survivor for the rest of his life. The breastworks materialized across the full width of the plain, solid, dark, unbroken from the river to the swamp, the black mouths of dozens of cannon pointing directly at them from raised platforms that gave the gunners a clear view of every man on the field. And between the columns and the wall, 1,000 yards of open ground with nothing to hide behind. No ditch, no stone fence, no farmhouse. Not even a tree, just flat, wet Louisiana mud stretching to the horizon like an invitation to die. The veterans understood immediately. Men who had stormed fortified towns in Spain knew what defensive firepower looked like. They knew the geometry of crossfire. They knew what canister did to men in the open. And they knew, with the certainty of professionals who had spent years learning the mathematics of killing, that crossing this plain in formation was going to cost more than any battlefield in their experience. A rocket hisses up from the British rear, the signal to advance at the double. Along the American line, the guns do not fire. Jackson's gunners wait. The silence is worse than noise, because silence from a fortified line means the defenders are choosing their moment. The columns quicken. The ground grabs at boots. Formations designed on parade grounds lose their shape in Louisiana mud. Gaps open between companies. Men stumble over ground that is trying to hold them in place. The American artillery opens at roughly 500 yards. Patterson's 20 guns fire first, raking the columns from the right flank. The sound is not a single crash, but a rolling sequence, as each gun fires in turn. Canister sprays across the formations at waist height. From the front, the main line guns open. 24-pounders firing round shot at range, switching to canister as the British close. 12-pounders firing grape shot, clusters of iron balls that spread on impact like a fist opening into fingers. The effect on massed infantry in the open is beyond anything drill can prepare a man for. Whole files vanish from the ranks. Officers on horseback, silhouetted against the morning sky, fall first because they are the tallest targets on the field. The soldiers behind them step over the bodies and keep walking forward because that is what their training demands. But the geometry is inescapable. Hit from the front, hit from the right, no cover. The Louisiana plain that looked like nothing on a map is a killing floor designed by a man who understood that the ground itself could be a weapon. Then the fascines crisis arrives. The lead companies, staggering under the weight of sugarcane bundles, are the first to absorb the canister. Men drop the fascines and try to take cover that does not exist. Others press forward with courage that deserves a better fate and reach the ditch. It is wider and deeper than anyone described, choked with thorn bush and standing water. Without the fascines to bridge it, they are trapped. Some wade in. The thorns catch everything: wool uniforms, leather crossbelts, exposed skin on hands and faces. The water is cold enough to shock and deep enough to slow every step to a crawl. Men pile into the ditch because the ground behind them is swept by canister, and the ditch at least offers the illusion of cover below the lip of the breastworks. But the ditch is not cover. It is a holding pen. Above them, musket barrels protrude through loopholes at a range where a man could reach out and touch the muzzle that kills him. The defenders fire down into the ditch the way a man fires into a barrel. At this range, aiming is unnecessary. You point the musket into the mass of bodies below and pull the trigger and reload and point again, and the mass grows smaller with each discharge. Pakenham watches his plan disintegrate from behind the lines. The flanking force under Thornton, which was supposed to cross the Mississippi by boat during the night, seize Patterson's 20 guns and turn them against the American line, has not arrived. The current was too strong. The canal was too shallow. The boats were hours late. The one element that might have changed the geometry of the battle, silencing the crossfire that was tearing the columns apart, is still on the water while the army dies on the plain. Without Patterson's guns neutralized, every step forward is a step into converging fire from two directions. The assault is failing, and no adjustment can save it. Pakenham does what brave commanders do when plans collapse. He rides forward, into the killing ground. Toward the faltering 44th Regiment that had dropped its fascines 300 yards too early, leaving the assault columns without tools to cross the ditch. His presence briefly steadies the wavering formation. A musket ball kills his horse. He remounts. A ball hits his arm. He wraps it. A blast of canister tears through his body. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law of Wellington, veteran of Salamanca, dies on Louisiana mud. Major General Gibbs falls beside him. Colonel Rennie, who had actually breached the American line on the far right, is killed inside the redoubt he just captured. The chain of command shatters in minutes. From the perspective of a private soldier still standing in the open, with canister cutting the air around his ears, the world has collapsed. The general is dead. The officers are dead. The man who was standing beside him 30 seconds ago is face down in the mud. The orders have stopped coming. Some men throw themselves flat and press their faces into mud that tastes of gunpowder and blood. Some run, and running in the opposite direction from cannon fire takes a courage of its own, because the instinct of a trained soldier is to stay with his unit even when his unit is dying. And some, a number that speaks to something deeper than training, stand where they are in the open, under canister fire, and continue firing at a wall they will never reach, and loading and firing again, and loading and firing again, until a round finds them and they go down where they stood. Because standing and dying in formation is what British infantry has been doing since before any man on this field was born. It is not bravery, it is identity. And identity does not negotiate with canister. The entire main assault takes roughly 30 minutes. In half an hour, the finest army on earth has been shattered by a line of mud and timber and thorn. The guns fall silent. The plain that was featureless an hour ago is carpeted with scarlet. Red-coated bodies scattered across 1,500 yards of Louisiana mud in patterns that told the story of the assault from the air if anyone had been above to look. Dense clusters where canister had struck formations. Scattered individuals where men had broken and run. A thick line of dead and dying in and around the thorn ditch where the assault had stalled and the killing had been most efficient. The ditch itself was choked with bodies tangled in thorn bush. Men who had waded in could not wade out because the men behind them had fallen on top of them, and the thorns held everything in place like a net made of pain. Abandoned fascines and ladders littered the field between the ditch and the starting position, dropped by men who had been carrying them when the canister arrived and whose hands had opened when their bodies stopped working. Officers' horses lay on their sides with their legs still extended in the positions they had fallen. The silence after the roar was broken only by the wounded calling for water from a field so thick with smoke that the sun was a brown disk overhead, and the smell of black powder sat on the tongue like a second taste that would never wash out. The accounting was staggering. British, 291 killed, 1,262 wounded, 484 captured or missing. Total, 2,037. Among the dead, Pakenham and Gibbs and multiple senior officers. The command structure of the British expedition decapitated. American, 13 killed, 39 wounded, 19 missing. Total, 71. For every American who fell, nearly 30 British soldiers were struck down. In the history of 19th century warfare, no major engagement produced a comparable ratio. Pakenham's body was preserved in a cask of rum for the voyage back to England. The general sent to deliver the richest port in North America went home as cargo. The rum that preserved him was the same spirit his soldiers had been drinking for courage the night before the assault. The man and the courage arrived at the same destination in the same container. The most enduring myth of New Orleans is the image of buckskin-clad frontiersmen picking off red-coated soldiers from behind cotton bales with long rifles. It is a compelling picture. It became the founding image of American frontier mythology, and it is largely wrong. The riflemen were there. The Kentucky and Tennessee sharpshooters fought with skill that the British themselves acknowledged. But the killing, the mass killing that turned a battle into an execution, was done by cannon. By naval-grade artillery firing canister and grape shot into massed formations at ranges where the spread pattern of each discharge covered the width of a company front. By Patterson's crossfire that Jackson himself identified as the decisive factor in a letter written days after the battle. By a defensive position so carefully engineered that frontal assault was suicidal before the first British boot touched the field. Jackson understood something that most military commanders of his era did not. You do not need better soldiers to win a battle. You need better ground. And if the ground is not good enough, you make it better. You dig. You build. You drag naval guns into earthen redoubts. You fill a ditch with thorns. You let the enemy's courage carry them into a position where courage is irrelevant, because the geometry of the kill zone has already decided the outcome. The most experienced army in the world was destroyed not by better soldiers, but by a better position. The news reached a nation still scarred from the burning of its capital. The effect was electric. Jackson became the hero who beat the British Empire with an army of regulars, militia, pirates, and freedmen. That legend carried him to the presidency in 1828. The British buried the defeat under the larger drama of Waterloo 5 months later. But among the veterans who had been at New Orleans, the memory never faded. They had fought across Spain and France and never encountered anything like the defenses at Rodriguez Canal. They had charged cannon at Badajoz. They had stood in squares at Quatre Bras. They had not been afraid. But on a January morning in Louisiana, they had stared at a mud wall and a ditch full of thorns, and for the first time in their careers, they had known, before the order was given, that the ground they were about to cross would kill them. They crossed it anyway, because that is what they were trained to do. And the mud wall did exactly what its builder designed it to do. It killed them. 2,037 men, 30 minutes, one ditch full of thorns. And the lesson that Jackson wrote in Louisiana clay and British blood still applies. The best army in the world can be destroyed not by a better army, but by a better position. The wall was the weapon, and the wall won.